for your introduction. Right. So the German historian of philosophy Karl Lewis contends the Stirner Einzige, I'm quoting, is in reality an ultimate logical consequence of Hegel's world historical construction, end of quote. While Stirner's work is no doubt a reaction to Hegelian speculation, I would argue that Stirner is neither the anti-Hegel nor a perfected Hegel, but he is just otherwise than Hegel. In other words, Stirner is neither a Hegelian nor a post-Hegelian philosopher, simply because he is no longer a philosopher. More precisely, Stirner steps out of the long trajectory of philosophy because he gets rid of philosophy's main tools, namely abstractions, universals, and concepts. As Stirner dismisses both concepts and their definitions, his unique one is beyond definition. Even Carl Schmitt, who generally is not a reliable interpreter, understands this. Stirner's unique one is thus not just the development of the self-consciousness with which Hegel concludes his phenomenology of spirit. By constructing the unique one as a creative nothingness, Stirner not only replaces the self as a notion with the unpredictable activity of the unique one. Stirner also refuses to bring under the yoke of consciousness this activity, which he mentions as his own various actions. I make, I take, I consume, for example. Unfortunately, since the 19th century, Stirner's rigorous downsizing of the sphere of action of the unique one is misrepresented with the reductionist label of anarchist individualism. Only in recent times, the reconsideration of modern narrations may allow us to appreciate Stirner's actual theoretical opening. In particular, the recovery of Nietzsche's exposure of European philosophy as a series of recastings of the Platonic split world goes hand in hand with the lifting of the ban on Stirner's work. Derrida's texts are brilliant examples of both phenomena. Yet neither Stirner nor Nietzsche's theoretical tools seem to have found a practical application in the construction of most radical politics. I contend that the Nietzschean exposure of European philosophy as Platonism not only allows us to understand the theoretical relevance of Stirner's farewell to philosophy. Nietzsche's equation of philosophy with Platonism also makes visible the extraordinary political potential of Stirner's non-philosophical stance. In other words, by opening the way to a non-philosophical, that is, non-Platonic and non-principled theoretical horizon, Stirner also clears the field for the emergence of a non-philosophical, that is, non-Platonic and non-principled politics. I anticipate that I will conclude my intervention by suggesting a political use of Stirner's and Nietzsche's non-philosophical perspective. So let's get into the matter. We may historically contextualize the intellectual relationship of Stirner with Hegel by briefly recalling the previous interaction of Johann Herder with his master, Immanuel Kant. On the model of Luther's internalization of religion, the Lutheran Kant notoriously constructs the abstract notions of time and space as universal inner conditions of human knowledge. Each human being projects the inner notions of space and time upon the outer world as its ordering structures, according to Kant. As for Herder, thought is necessarily expressed in words. He retorts to the Kantian universalization of the European notions of space and time with an argument of post-colonial flavor, for us at least. I'm quoting Herder: time, duration, space, essence, matter, body, virtue, justice, freedom, gratitude are not in the mouth of the Peruvians, meaning the inhabitants of Peru. And Herder underlines the historical and geographical nature of abstractions. I'm quoting Herder. The church language of the Russian nation is for the most part Greek. The Christian concepts of the Latvians are German words or German concepts transposed into Latvian, end of quote. Herder stresses that such half-understood concepts behave as ghosts. However, Herder not only exposes the negative effects of importing abstractions from other languages, but he also analyzes the process of production of abstractions within the same language. In particular, he observes, I'm quoting, how verbs become nouns, and they are the easiest step to abstraction. Well, Hegel too is not contented with the Kantian production and use of abstraction, but he has different motivations. Hegel considers abstractions too rigid for our plastic and moving reality, so that he strives instead, I'm quoting Hegel, to bring the consolidated thoughts into a condition of fluidity, of flow. Hegel produces such a fluidification of thoughts by recovering the traditional philosophical tool of contradiction. We may recall that the notion of contradiction is invented by pre-Platonic Greek writers as the possibly first philosophical abstraction in the form of negation. Contradiction takes center stage of the philosophical discourse with Parmenides' joint invention of being and non-being, and it is then systematized by Aristotle. On the model of Luther's internalization of religion, the Lutheran Hegel fluidifies thoughts by inserting contradiction into each and every entity. In the powerfully innovative Hegelian construction, each and every thing hosts, so to speak, its own negation. This inner contradiction fuels, as it were, ceaseless transformations. This is a distinctive Hegelian addition to European metaphysics and the core of Hegelian dialectics. We may recall that according to Marx, Hegelian dialectics, I'm quoting Marx, is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. And this was Marx. In other words, for Marx, one can extract the rational kernel of Hegelian dialectics from its mystical shell just by applying the metaphysical tool of contradiction to what Marx calls material reality first, rather than to reality's construction and thought. This astonishingly naive use of the metaphysical tool of contradiction contradicts even Marx's cautious stance on the relation between means and ends. At best, we may say that Marx is seduced, if not bewitched, by the power of dialectics to grab transformations. Yet, Marx forgets that a dialectical grabbing of what he calls material transformations is an operational thought. By relying on the metaphysical tool of contradiction, materialism operates as another metaphysics. Borrowing an expression from Deleuze and Guattari, we may say that the dialectical fluidification of thoughts operates as a metaphysical apparatus of capture of reality that is much more powerful than traditional metaphysics. This is exactly what Stirner imputes to Hegel. Stirner sees the Hegelian system, I'm quoting, as just the outermost violence on the part of thought, its highest despotism and autocracy, the triumph of spirit, and with it, the triumph of philosophy. End of quote. The Hegelian triumph of philosophy is the culmination of the path of metaphysics, from its Greek beginning as philosophy to its Christian recasting. More precisely, Stirner observes that, I'm quoting, only the more recent philosophy since Descartes has taken seriously the task of bringing Christianity to its full effectiveness by elevating cognitive consciousness to be the only true and valid one. In other words, Stirner not only recalls the following Luther's internalizing path, Descartes identifies the human essence with thought. Stirner also underlines that German speculative philosophy has taken a further step in this direction. He writes, "The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of spirits and ghosts, has found its right order in speculative philosophy." Stirner analyzes the construction of this realm of spirits as the human production of thoughts, concepts, and ideas. Anticipating Nietzsche, he explains, I'm quoting, "Truths are phrases, ways of speaking, words, logos in Greek. Brought into connection or in rank and file, they form logic, science, philosophy. They are human institutions and human creatures, and if one passes them off as divine revelations, they are still my estranged property." This is indeed the crucial point of Stirner's argument. Thoughts, concepts, and ideas are human products, regardless of the shape they take in the course of human history. The being of the Greeks, the God of the Christians, the man of modern humanism, the nature of modern science. Nevertheless, Stirner warns, if we forget that all these notions are human constructions, they become objective and autonomous entities that exert their ghostly powers over their very human producers. This is why Stirner demands that, I'm quoting, "we are indeed to have spirit," that is, thought, conceptions, ideas, faith, but spirit is not to have us. This is a veritable plan of action, which unfortunately is still generally undetected and thus also disregarded to date. For example, even a very insightful and well-documented reader, such as Roberto Calasso, contends that Stirner's criticism leads not to a position, but to aphasia. Yet Calasso mistakes for silence Stirner's refusal to engage with the philosophical discourse as a mere recombination of concepts. Stirner's philosophical silence rather marks the end of the trajectory of philosophical discourse by opening towards another regime of communication and action. Stirner shows us the path towards this novel regime of communication and action, away from sterile and counterproductive philosophical conceptualizations. We may more easily follow Stirner's indication after Nietzsche and Benjamin and Foucault and somewhat Latour walked this path too. Out of metaphor, we may attempt at engaging in theoretical practices that acknowledge our role of theoretical producers and do not hold us hostages of our theoretical products. How can we do this? Well, we can try together. We saw that both Herder and Stirner depicted abstract products that were no longer connected with their processes of production as ghosts. Moreover, we all know that the image of the spectre, which Herder and Stirner used as a powerful analytical tool, was then turned into the famous opening line of the manifesto of the Communist Party. "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." I was quoting Marx and Engels, of course. We may reverse Marx and Engels' operation of appropriation by giving back to the image of the spectre its theoretical significance. More precisely, we may use the image of the spectre not simply as a fearful icon, as Marx and Engels did, but as a crossroad of senses, as Herder and Stirner did. In particular, by describing detached abstractions as specters, Stirner underlines not only the detachment of theories from their theorists, but also the uncontrollable haunting power of these detached theories. Following Stirner, we may then rephrase the opening of the manifesto and say that a double-faced spectre is haunting not only Europe, but the whole world. The spectre of the market in the words of its supporters, and capitalism, in the words of its critics. If we take seriously Stirner and Nietzsche, and to an extent Foucault, we should not ignore the spectral nature of the two-faced abstraction of the market and capitalism. In other words, we should not forget that the twin notions of the market and capitalism have been produced as alleged descriptions of the economic state of the affairs. Of course, as previously recalled, whilst the notion of the market is only used by the supporters of the regime of exchange of commodities, the notion of capitalism is also deployed by those who apparently want to overturn this regime. Yet, as Stirner would have said, also the regime of generalized exchange, whether you call it market or capitalism, is another totalizing abstraction, that is, a ghost. There is no economic system in place, apart from its spectral image in economic textbooks. What we all actually experience is an expanding variety of processes of commodification. Regrettably, we also experience the devastating effects on us and the planet of this expanding variety of commodification processes. Yet, following Stirner's hint, we may expose the attempts at presenting this variety of processes as a universal economic system already in place under the shape of the abstract notions of the market and capitalism. As Stirner knew well, this is not simply an issue of words. By conceding to the supporters of the market and to the critics of capitalism that their abstractions operate as an already universal condition that rules our reality, we erase three crucial kinds of human activities at once. First, we erase the occurrence of a plurality of different commodification processes. Second, we erase the operations of legal, political, social, and narrative apparatuses that allow commodification processes to occur. Third, and possibly more important, we erase all those human economic activities that escape the allegedly universal rule of exchange. Such a threefold erasure has a fundamental political effect. It confirms the contention that there is no alternative to the market, or, if you prefer, to capitalism, except perhaps in some hypothetical future. As a consequence, this erasure substantially undermines the efforts of those who, like me, want not only to contain commodification processes here and now, but also to reverse them into processes of decommodification. I have no time to further develop this argument here. However, I hope to have at least partly shown both the historical and the current relevance of Stirner's indictment of the philosophical horizon of concepts, ideas, and principles. I would just remark that if we follow Stirner and move out of the horizon of philosophy, we may also move out of the conceptual horizon that produced spectral monsters, such as the market and capitalism. And we may instead reopen the horizon of history and political action. Thank you.
Dr. Balzoni, thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation. All right, moving on. Next up, we have Tim Dowdall, whose presentation is entitled Stirner's Nihilistic Tendencies, Facts and Fictions. Dr. Dowdall?
Okay, let me first of all get this onto the Zoom. I knew the technical gremlins would get me. So view, reading view.
Is it working or?
No, I've
Because I can
just
share it on my end if it's not.
yeah, I've what an absolute bastard. Okay, so can you share it then?
Yes, I can. Let me open it real quick. It's opening, 1 second. PowerPoint is being a bit slow.
Yeah, my PowerPoint completely froze. So look, as time is of the essence here, I think I'll just start anyway. And if you get the PowerPoint up, Cal, then I'll tell you when we're moving screens.
I've got it right here. Let me share it real quick.
So let me start anyway. We'll probably, all of us here, agree that Stirner's prime cause is his own, namely the sovereignty of the individual, aka himself, the unique one, the ego, das Ich. This is onto page 2, please. Free from the tyranny of heteronymous abstractions, be they hegemonic institutions like the church or the state, or dogmatic beliefs like those based on God or humanity. You might also agree with the opinion that this is not an exceptionally outlandish position for Stirner to hold at his particular historical juncture, bearing in mind the general direction of philosophical inquiry with regard to the I, starting with Descartes and progressing through Locke, Berkeley, and Hume to the German idealists Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and also considering the fundamental anti-dogmatism of the European Enlightenment, which played such an important role for most, if not all, of the leading philosophers of the 18th century. Why then, and this is the question I wish to address today, is Stirner, despite his own comments about ending the work of the Enlightenment, frequently viewed not in terms of this conspicuous lineage, but rather as a harbinger of subsequent philosophical trends that veer towards the somber contemplation of the uncertainty, futility, and meaninglessness of human existence? Why, in short, has Stirner so often been viewed as a nihilist, and is this an epithet he himself would have chosen? Next slide, please. Let us start with some facts, pace Nietzsche. Although there is no evidence that Stirner ever used the word nihilism or any of its derivatives himself, soon after the publication of Der Einzige in 1844, the old Hegelian philosopher and pedagogue Karl Rosenkranz used the term in his journal to describe Stirner's thought. I quote, "Stirner's book is evidently the pinnacle of the one-sided subjective tendency in which the young Hegelian school has lost itself. In this work, it has transitioned from atheism to social radicalism. It has arrived at the state of nature, at brute tyranny, at ruthless license for all desires and passions, at the apotheosis of egoism and nothingness. Theoretically, such nihilism in relation to all ethical pathos cannot develop into anything. It could only be followed by the practice of egoistic fanaticism by revolution." Slide 4, please. Not long after, in 1847, an anonymous article appeared in a weekly national liberal journal, Die Grenzboten, where Stirner is presented as, I quote, another writer of this school of nihilism, the school, of course, being Die Freien. There then followed a hiatus of nearly half a century, where but for the short references made to him by Lange and Hartmann in the 1860s, Stirner might have been entirely forgotten in his homeland. Nonetheless, the few mentions Stirner did receive during this time included some that labeled him a nihilist, like those of the journalist and political theorist Karl Grün in 1874, the liberal politician Karl Biedermann in 81, and the positive philosopher Ernst Lars in 82. Indeed, by the time of the so-called first Stirner Renaissance in the 1890s, Stirner's reputation as a nihilist seems to have become quite firmly established. to the extent where since then there have been at least half a dozen published references to Stirner being a nihilist per decade. Number 5, please. I shall not test your patience by listing or indeed quoting all of the examples of descriptions of Stirner as a nihilist, but I'd like to make one important observation, namely that such accusations, for the term nihilist is invariably used in a pejorative way, come from all points of the socio-political compass, from journalists, writers, philosophers, theologians, sociologists, psychologists, academics, and political theorists and politicians that include nationalists, conservatives, liberals, social democrats, and socialists. All of the figures listed on that slide you're looking at the moment, and many more besides, have labeled Stirner a nihilist. Slide 6, please. There is one other observation that cannot be omitted, namely that Stirner's accusers clearly don't always mean the same thing when they call him a nihilist. The term nihilism is remarkably opaque, considering how common the word's usage has become. The reasons for this are both etymological and historical. Etymologically, it derives from the Latin word nihil, meaning nothing, but the simple addition of the Greek suffix ism means that there is no indication of what the nothingness refers to, unlike, for instance, with the word atheism, where the prefix and suffix clearly delineate the field of application. As a result, there are as many forms of nihilism as there are principles that can be denied. Historically, the term was used initially by critical commentators in a relatively undefined manner as a polemical device, indicating little more than the hopeless heterodoxy of the accused. Its status as the ultimate expression of negativity has since led to its being freely used and adapted within numerous different fields. Definitions of nihilism have thus multiplied unchecked over the course of the last 250 years or so, since it first appeared in French in the 1760s, followed by German in the 80s and English soon thereafter. Next slide, please. There are currently a dozen main types of nihilism, which you can see the list of on the screen. There are clearly some of these types, Mariological, for instance, which are highly specialized and not applicable to Stirner. But there are 3 which are most frequently associated with him, either implicitly or explicitly, namely political, moral, and existential nihilism. And I should like to acquaint you with some of the more obvious, not to say colorful, examples of each. The first type is political nihilism, a term which is generally considered synonymous with the 19th century phenomenon of Russian nihilism, a movement whose notoriety is based not only on its uncompromising commitment to the destruction of existing political institutions, but also on the almost complete absence of any post-apocalyptic positive program of socio-political reconstruction. This is evidently the sense in which it is meant by Biedermann when he speaks of Stirner's Der Einzige as a literary version of nihilism, and I quote, which allowed none but the sovereign ego to celebrate its triumphs on the ruins of society. Likewise, I'm sorry, we're on the wrong slide at the moment as far as I can see. Can you move another slide up? Likewise, and you can go one further slide beyond that one. Likewise, Masaryk, when he declares, and I quote again, in Der Einzige, he was already advocating political nihilism. For Stirner, a republic was no longer enough. The state as such is to be abolished. Perhaps most vivid of all is Hemann's description of the demonic anarchism and nihilism of Max Stirner, and I quote, whose followers want with dagger, revolver, and bombs to make themselves owners of the whole world. Next slide, please. The second type of nihilism most commonly applied to Stirner, and this is the one that has been most frequently appended to his name in the last 180 odd years, is moral nihilism. Bernd Lasker indeed goes so far as to say that moral nihilism is the fulcrum of the defamation and demonization of Stirner. It's implicit, for instance, in Keben's allegation of the nihilistic hangover, nihilistischer Katzenjammer, that Stirner's philosophy engenders, or even in Helms's Marxist critique of Stirner as a petty bourgeois proto-fascist. It's explicit, for instance, in Lars's phrase about his nihilistic Promethean abandonment of all that is moral, or Schröder's remark about Stirner's outspoken moral nihilism. Next slide, please. The third type of nihilism in which Stirner has inextricably been linked is existential nihilism, though in contrast to the other two, the connection is rarely made explicitly. Instead, it reaches its implicit apotheosis in Patterson's notorious book, The Nihilistic Egoist Max Stirner. Patterson's work is littered with inadequately substantiated descriptions of Stirner as a nihilist, though without a preceding adjective to reveal the type of nihilism involved. Patterson, however, resolves the riddle in his concluding remarks. I quote, "In the present book, I have tried to locate and define the main resemblances between existentialist philosophy and the philosophy of Der Einzige. And in doing so, I have suggested that the point of departure for both Stirner and the existentialists is this crucial experience of the meaninglessness of all things." Talking of colorful examples of descriptions of Stirner as a nihilist, how about these choice phrases taken from Patterson's diatribe? Der Einzige is the most complete and uncompromising of all nihilist manifestos, and Stirner, the avowed representative of the most extreme dimension of nihilism, in whom the monster of nihilism assuredly found its most complete avatar. Patterson's myopic view of Stirner has been enthusiastically adopted by other academics like David Holbrook, who recognizes in Stirner a sort of John the Baptist figure, the prophet of Nietzschean nihilism, and Donald Crosby, who identifies a striking similarity between Stirner, Nietzsche, and Sartre, all of whom he labels indirectly as existential nihilists. Next slide, please. What then can be said about Stirner's relationship to these three types of nihilism? As far as political nihilism is concerned, the connection is not much more than tenuous. It is true that Stirner does seem to have had an influence on the fathers of Russian populism, Bakunin, Herzen, and Belinsky, who were the forebears of Russian nihilism, as, however, did so-called young Hegelianism as a whole. Engels suggests that Stirner had a significant impact on Bakunin, but there is reason to believe that he may have been trying to damn by association, as others have done with the enfant terrible of Max Stirner, for instance, Hartmann in comparing Stirner favorably with Nietzsche. The fact is that there is an essential incongruity between Bakunin's view of the primarily social function of the individual and Stirner's focus on the individual egoist, for whom society is a coercive abstraction. For Stirner, the problem is not, as it was for Bakunin, man's alienation from his social essence, but rather the alienating nature of society itself for the individual. Several commentators, including Masaryk and Isaiah Berlin, have identified certain similarities between Herzen and Stirner regarding their shared aversion to abstractions and endorsement of individualism. Likewise, between Belinsky and Stirner concerning the concept of egoism. There is reliable evidence of Belinsky having known of and spoken about Stirner, though he rejected Stirner's concept of egoism, at least as he seemingly erroneously understood it. Stirner's egoism apparently had a more positive impact on Nikolai Sveshnev, to whose secret society Dostoevsky belonged in the late 1840s. Dostoevsky is said to have had a copy of Der Einzige in his library, and Turgenev probably got to know Stirner, however cursorily, during his time at the University of Berlin from 1838 to 41. Thus, the two foremost contemporaneous literary writers on the subject of Russian nihilism had, at the very least, some knowledge of Stirner's ideas. Next slide, please. However, when we come to the actual ideologists of Russian nihilism, a movement that started in the 1860s, there is little or no direct trace of Stirner to be found. Chernyshevsky does continue to endorse egoism like his mentor Belinsky before him, but this is unlikely to be any more than a distant inheritance, especially as Chernyshevsky's theory of rational egoism ultimately finds expression in a model of logical utilitarianism. Pisarev, who, unlike Chernyshevsky, wore the label of nihilist as a badge of honor, combined the concepts of egoism, amorality, and annihilation to create his own potent brand of Russian nihilism, which, for Masaryk at least, shows both ideological and terminological similarities with Stirner. Nonetheless, there's no documentary evidence whatsoever of any direct influence of Stirner on Pisarev, Chernyshevsky, or their successor, Nechayev, the most nihilists of nihilists, in Hingly's words, the ruthless murderer, blackmailer, extortioner, confidence trickster, chief owner of the nihilist movement, etc. Herein lies the essential difference between Stirner's thought and Russian nihilism, namely that Stirner's primary aim is not annihilation of the state through clandestine terrorism and violent revolution, but the liberation of the individual from the tyranny of mythical hegemonic abstractions. For Stirner, revolution, far from being synonymous with liberation, is an obligation in the form of a fixed idea, which in dialectical fashion replaces one hegemony with another. You will probably all be aware of the famous quotation from Der Einzige on this subject, which you can see on the next screen, please. Stirner's focus, in other words, is on Zoon-Logikon, while the Russian nihilists are concerned with Zoon-Politikon. What the analysis of the relationship between Stirner and Russian political nihilism shows is many coincidental connections, a few striking similarities, some evidence of influence, but a fundamental discrepancy in terms of aims and objectives, and no reasonable grounds for describing Stirner as a political nihilist. When it comes to moral nihilism, however, the argument is less clear-cut. Nietzsche famously awarded himself the accolade of being the first immoralist, but Stirner, if only chronologically, has a stronger claim to the title. For Stirner, the concept of good and evil, the building block, as it were, of morality, is simply meaningless. He explains, I quote, "Away then with every concern that is not altogether my concern. You think at least the good cause must be my concern? What's good? What's bad? Why, I myself am my concern, and I am neither good nor bad. Neither has meaning for me." He damns chastity, justifies infanticide, apparently endorses incest and polygamy, supports the right to suicide, and condones murder under certain circumstances. Stirner, in other words, out-Machiavellis the prince of immoralists, Machiavelli himself. Stirner's immorality is based on the conflict between morality and the egoism that he champions. If morality is defined as a system of moral conduct proposed by and for a society, then how can it apply to Stirner, for whom it is anathema to impose any form of system on anyone, and for whom the values of each egoist are sacrosanct and cannot therefore be compromised by being conjoined with others to form a code of conduct? Next slide, please. Morality for Stirner is a tool of the state and a function of its ideology. It is thus clearly irreconcilable with what one might call his ego system, the union of egoists, which is supposed to be the natural manifestation of the association of autonomous, enlightened individuals seeking their advantage in relationships with other members of the species, rather than an externally enforced template for the ethics of social behavior. Stirner makes no attempt to reinvent morality in an egoistic form, as has sometimes been suggested, as this would defeat his purpose of emancipating each individual to be able to choose for itself, which is one of Stirner's most fundamental principles. All of the above undoubtedly qualify Stirner as a moral nihilist, of the most extreme form, indeed, of moral eliminativism, beyond even what is proposed by J.L. McKee in Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, where he argues for moral relativism, but nonetheless against murder. For Stirner, nothing is off limits. He rejects moral facts, moral truths, and moral knowledge, and he explicitly states that morality, along with religion, should be discarded. But nonetheless, the question remains whether moral nihilist is a useful epithet for Stirner, as it's more of a conveniently pejorative classification for a perceived moral pariah than an apt description of the fundamental focus of Stirner's thought. Stirner is a champion of individual autonomy, not a prophet of the moral void. His position cannot be used to justify genocide, as those of some of his accusers and adversaries can be. He does not set out to be a moral nihilist, as Pissarev, for instance, does, to be a political nihilist. Demythologization in the interests of the liberty of the autonomous individual is what he promotes, and morality is merely one of the victims of this process. While, therefore, it would be disingenuous to deny the elements of moral nihilism in Stirner's ideas, it would equally be misleading and inappropriate to view him as a moral nihilist. Now, I think my time is running out, and therefore I will rush through existential nihilism, which is perhaps the form of nihilism which is most conspicuously hung over Stirner's head since World War II. Let me just say that, yes, there are similarities. Like the existentialist, Stirner is a rebel. He abhors abstractions, believes existence precedes essence, and starts from the perspective of ex nihilo ad nihilum subjectivism. And yes, some link could be made between Stirner's ideas of ownness and the existentialist notion of authenticity. as for existential nihilism, where are the negative themes of existentialism, the sense of meaninglessness, the confrontation with nothingness, the ontological despair, the angst? And if, as I suspect we all agree, they are nowhere to be found in Der Einzige, why do so many writers associate Stirner with Nietzsche's vision of nihilism, which is at the root of existential nihilism? Next slide. I suspect that at least part of the answer can be found in what I call a tale of two nothings. For many of the above commentators and others besides do not tire of pointing out that Stirner's magnum opus is sandwiched between the identical opening and closing lines, Ich hab mein Sach auf nichts gestellt, which for the sake of good understanding, I will translate as I have made nothing my cause. The parallel with the Epicurean atheist idea of life being sandwiched between two nothings, what Onfray terms l'entre deux néants, is too conspicuous to be ignored by those intent on condemning Stirner's waywardness. There are a few examples of this. Lucchesi talks about the two nothings, Patterson does, Nishitani does. But they disregard the fact that the book's title includes no negative reference whatsoever and concentrate instead on the less prominent but more controversial line that starts and finishes the text. They thereby ignore the primary meaning of nichts, which is in fact nothing but myself. Stirner explicitly lists all of the causes to which the individual is expected to subjugate himself: goodness, God, humanity, etc., and rejects them all. The nichts, nothing in the heading, therefore, refers to all abstract, generalized external causes. Stirner submits to none of them. Perhaps we should then quickly switch to number 19, slide 19, because we're running out of time, or we've run out of time, I see. It didn't help to have this little problem with PowerPoint. So I won't try to analyze nothingness in Stirner, but just to say that it's clearly not the sort of nothingness that one would normally associate with nihilism. What we find in Stirner's thought is the opposite of nihilism, pessimism, and eudemophobia. It is hedonism, optimism, and eudaimonism. And this brings us briefly and in conclusion to Stirner's place in the history of ideas, which it seems to me is with the materialism and hedonism properly understood of Democritus and Epicurus and all the anti-Platonists that follow them, rather than with anyone who, like Meinlander, Heidegger, or Charon, might be considered a nihilist. Onfray characterizes the anti-Platonists as follows: they want happiness on earth here and now, not later in some hypothetical, unattainable world. This also represents an accurate description of Stirner's worldview. I think I'll avoid the last page of this because you can see it on slide 20, on the last slide. But suffice it to say that the rejection of Stirner using the extreme imprecation of nihilism is more a conflict between the dogmatic defenders of various doctrinaire ideologies and their perceived enemy in the form of the ultimate demythologizer, whose denial of the validity of absolutes discredits and fatally undermines their fictional structures of belief. In this sense, Stirner may be called a nihilist, but it's a sense that adds little of importance to an understanding of his thought. In fact, it actually adds not a lot more than two big fat nothings. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Dowdall. All right, thank you to both of our presenters today. Right now, our Q&A section is now open. We've got about 15 minutes for any questions. Feel free to type them out into the Q&A section, and I will read them to our presenters. All right, we've got one from Jacob Blumenfeld for Tim. Great job. Can you talk more about Stirner as hedonist, optimist, and eudaimonist? And what are your favorite non-nihilist readings of Stirner?
Well, yeah, thanks, Jacob. Yeah, Stirner is hedonist. I mean, it's already come up in previous panels here about self-enjoyment being one of the most important principles that one finds in Stirner. And generally, he is looking for a reading of the life of the individual in terms of being liberated from abstractions. And so, in other words, what he's searching for is the enjoyment of life, which fits in with all of those ancient Greek concepts of hedonism, optimism, eudaimonism, etc., which you find in Epicurus, in the Pyrrhonists, and so on. You will find throughout Der Einzige references to Greek philosophy. He doesn't go into very much detail about it, but it is clear that he's well aware of the Greek philosophers that I'm referring to. As far as non-nihilist readings, yeah, I mean, of course, I think the one that's had perhaps the greatest effect in modern times is Bernd Lasker's, followed by Bernd Kast's, because they really changed the way that Stirner was viewed or has been viewed in the German world to start off with. And there was this kind of birth of a new interest in Stirner, which they created. Funnily enough, you know, it was Helms with his highly negative reading that created the second Stirner Renaissance in the 60s. But what I would call the third Stirner Renaissance was caused, I think, largely by Lasker and Kast, both of whom have anti-nihilist readings. And that then feeds into the Anglophone world, where certainly both David Leopold and Saul Newman have anti-nihilist readings as well.
Thank you. For another question, we have a request for the PowerPoint. Are you planning on releasing that anywhere, or?
Yeah, I can do. I will. I've given it actually to Cal, so Cal.
Yeah, I can send it out to all of the attendees. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Excellent. We have a question for Ricardo. To what extent could we say that Stirner's rejection of philosophy maps onto a more contemporary critique of philosophy, in the sense that non-philosophers such as Francois Laurel would describe philosophy as a capital form of thought in a way that founds an internal intellectual conceptual market and mode of philosophical production of texts and interpretive discourses?
Well, technically, you can call Laruelle non-philosopher, but actually he works and acts and writes as a philosopher, or at least he believes so. Philosophy is an enterprise that's still alive because of the university. If what I said makes any sense, Stirner opened another path that was followed by, well, I can list to you in the 19th century, Marx, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and then you can go on in the 20th century. The renaissance of philosophy in the 20th century, because there are no philosophers in the 18th, after Hegel, it's difficult to find a philosopher. And in the 20th century is an effect of higher education. I mean, it's a kind of revival in the sense of fundamentalist revival, I would say. What is going on is that the enterprise that we used to call philosophy took other ways. Say, I named a few writers. I cannot call them philosophers, Benjamin, for instance, or Foucault. They are not philosophers, and they are much more productive.
Thank you very much. Next, we have an anonymous question to Dowdall. How would you reach the conclusion that Stirner is a hedonist instead of a nihilist? Materialist makes sense, of course.
Well, I think it's based, as I mentioned in the previous answer, it's based on the concept of self-enjoyment, which Stirner repeats. I just found the quote: "Mein Verkehr mit der Welt besteht darin, dass ich sie genieße." So I don't know if everybody speaks German, but my relationship with the world is based on me enjoying it, und so sie zu meinem Selbstgenuss verbrauche, and that I use it up for my self-enjoyment. Der Verkehr ist Weltgenuss und gehört zu meinem Selbstgenuss. So he goes on about how the using up of life is, or should be at least, I don't mean that in a moral sense, but should be through the enjoyment of life. And that's something which is repeated throughout or in various places in Der Einzige. Also, you need to think about the absence of any of the normal nihilistic, pessimistic themes in Stirner. They just aren't there anywhere. For instance, a lot of those writers, philosophers, etc., that one would consider as nihilists are antinatalists. There's absolutely no antinatalism in Stirner. His first wife died in childbirth. It's just absent from his writing generally. And I think also his union of egoists idea, it shows quite a lot of optimism to the point of naivety. So I think that you have to realize that there is a lot of very positive approach towards life and being an individual in life. And I know, the question of whether one should talk about Stirner's biography or whether it doesn't in some way distract from his message. But I think it would only be possible for somebody to take the sort of life that Stirner had with such equanimity if he had a fundamentally positive and optimistic outlook on existence. And I think that's evidenced in Der Einzige.
Thank you so much. We have about 6 minutes left, so I'll try to get through the next 2 questions. From Justin Cowett, they ask, what is the most comprehensive book on the history or genealogy of the term nihilism?
Well, yeah, I guess that's for me again. It's a very good question because, in all honesty, I don't think one exists. There are an amazing array of books about nihilism. Some of them involve Stirner and some of them don't. But there are really lots and lots of titles. And in my opinion, none of them does a very good job at explaining the etymology of nihilism and the meanings of nihilism, because there are so many meanings of nihilism. And in fact, I'm at the moment writing a book on Stirner and nihilism, where probably a quarter of it is taken up precisely with explaining the meaning of nihilism and how it evolved as a concept. Because nihilism, as I mentioned, has been around since the middle of the 18th century, and the term has changed so much in meaning in that time. So I think my answer to the question would be, wait until my book comes out next year and probably start with that, because I hope I give a balanced view on both nihilism's etymology, history, etymology, and meaning.
Thank you so much. And finally, we have a question from Nathan Wood. Does Stirner have an implicit concept of authenticity at work underlying his philosophical rejection of the ghosts or illusions that we ought to abandon?
Shall I?
Yes, that question is open to either presenter, I believe.
It's a risky business to compare ghosts with illusions, because in this case, you make revive a notion of truth. And Stirner has nothing to do with truth. Truth is central tenets of metaphysics. Truth is important for philosophers, for theologians, for scientists. Stirner is not part of the metaphysical stream, so to speak. For him, ghosts became ghosts because they are estranged. They are production, they are estranged from their producers. So it's not an identity that one of the ghosts. It's a process that produces ghosts, and nothing to do with authenticity.
Thank you both.
I'm not sure I totally agree with that. If I can just jump in for a second. I think that you can make that comparison between ownness and authenticity. And part of ownness is precisely rejecting those ghosts, rejecting the abstractions. And so I do think that there is some sort of connection that at least can be made there concerning authenticity and the rejection of abstractions.
Well, we have 2 minutes left. I would like to thank both of you, Dr. Dowdall and Dr. Baldessone. If you all have any forthcoming works, other talks, anything that you would like to plug while we have some time, we have no other questions in at the moment. Feel free to do so.
Ricardo?
Actually, I'd like just to read what I was meant to read at the beginning. I would like to warmly thank the organizers of this long due first annual Max Stirner Symposium, in the hope that their adjective annual will help providing us with a likewise long due regular meeting and discussing space.
Okay, well, I'll certainly second that. And I mean, the fact that the PowerPoint didn't come up at the beginning was a bit of a problem because it meant I had to cut a few bits out of my presentation, my paper. I perhaps would like to leave everybody with a little bit of an association, which is that I think that the problem, one of the problems that Stirner has, or one of the reasons that Stirner is criticized so much, is because he is the ultimate pluralist. You couldn't take pluralism any further than Stirner does. And so he's therefore very much a target for monists. And just to give a little example, a little illustration of the essence of Stirner's pluralism, I'd like to just quote a little bit from the life of Brian, where Brian says to the mob, "You've got it all wrong. You don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anyone. You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals." And I think there's this amazing link between Stirner and the life of Brian, Stirner and Brian, but also in the reaction of monism, of monist points of view, of ideologies towards both the life of Brian and Stirner. In case anyone is interested, there's a German, I think he is theologian, called Hans Wiersma, who described the life of Brian, would you believe it, as nihilism. So there you go, Stirner and the life of Brian.
Well, that was not quite a connection I was expecting, but it's much appreciated. So thank you to everyone on this panel. This was an excellent one to listen to. I thoroughly enjoyed both talks. So this panel is concluded. We are now going to go into an hour-long break, but there is a slight schedule change, which I want everyone to be aware of before we dismiss, which is that, so the first presenter for the next panel after the lunch break was unfortunately not able to come today. He is sick. So instead, we are going to push that panel back by 20 minutes. So we're going to actually have an 80-minute lunch break instead of a 60-minute lunch break. So we'll be resuming at 1:40 EST. Okay. But again, thank you both. Thank you, Corey, for moderating. And I will see y'all after the lunch break.